Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialists for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit the website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on the website, you can pick up revision guides, you can get flashcards, you can get revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is Dr Simone Kolysh. Simone, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much.
And firstly, a really big thank you. What time is it where you are at the moment?
It's about 4:30 in the morning.
Wow. And you're coming in from?
Maryland, United States.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being up at that time in the morning. I really, really do appreciate it. So Simone, I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who they are and what they do.
Sure. Well, at the moment, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Hood College in Maryland, United States, and I graduated from a sociology PhD program in 2019, and I went to a public school, the City University of New York Graduate Center, and prior to that, I got a degree in public health, and prior to that, a degree in biology. So, I've had an interesting path to sociology as a professional.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting move from biology to eventually sociology. So why the sort of change in direction and journey, Simone?
Yeah, definitely. So I was always into science as a child and into biology and anatomy and human physiology. And I was going to be a physician, probably an ER doctor. I watched House MD and was obsessed with it. And, I went into NYU as a biology undergraduate. I finished pre-med. And somewhere along the line, I met a couple of intersex activists. And intersex people are folks who, upon inspection when they're born, are not deemed wholly male or wholly female, and learned that, we put these children through unnecessary surgeries in order to fit a rigid sex binary and a rigid gender binary. And it really shook me to my core that physicians would do something that is to appeal, that is really done to appeal to society, and it's not done for biological reasons. And so that was the first crack in the foundation that there's something social influencing the field of medicine. And so then the more I pulled at that thread, and that was the reason why I went to public health as a master's, the more I learned of social determinants of health and illness and about inequality. And then I went to work with terminally ill cancer patients in Brooklyn, New York, and saw firsthand just how important the social is in determining whether you live or die, and burnt out during that job, truly. And so I decided to do a PhD in sociology completely randomly. I Googled a couple of social sciences, because I do think it's all connected, and I do think it all provides an answer, however partial. And so I went through political science and anthropology. I have a minor in anthropology, so that wasn't that far off. And then I think I applied to socio-medical sciences at Columbia University and to sociology programs. And that was the first time I ever took a sociology course, but I think it was really ultimately to understand why institutions are set up the way they are to result in the outcomes that we have.
That's really interesting that you said they're all connected, actually, because obviously one of the big areas that often students look at is sociology a science. Having done a BA in biology and now working in sociology, do you consider it a science as such?
Of course. I mean, I've been a scientist since I was 14 years old, and I was working on cancer research. The reason I say that it is all a form of science is because when you're, for example, working to figure out, I was working on mice and pancreatic cancer to kind of illuminate the process of how to better diagnose it, right? And then I would later work with like microscopic worms to understand an evolutionary pattern, which, explains how these worms can inform us about ourselves, in an evolutionary way. And so sociology does the same thing. It illuminates for us how something works that is already present in society. So it's a science because it is descriptive. It's a science because it is theoretical in terms of providing frameworks and perspectives to understand what's going on. It gives us a very specific vocabulary that other sciences do not to explore humans and their complexity, so it has its lexicon, right? It has its sort of way of understanding the world. And and it has its place, like I said, across social science and science in general, because no other discipline can do that. And I know people kind of think they know certain things, like they understand their racial position or maybe their gender, but these are still topics or social facts to study, and people have for centuries. So it's a science in that it also has a legacy and a history and a foundation, however troublesome it is. But so are all the foundations to all of Western science, So yeah, for sure, I consider it a science also because, and this is the last point I'll make, we rely on a variety of tools and methods to test hypotheses or, or explore something in order to come up with hypotheses, and so there's this wide range of, instruments we can use, which is fascinating because we are people studying people. And I remember someone trying to dismiss my conversation by saying it's not a real science, and like that people are complex, and that's why, and they're not like as easy as protons and electrons to understand or even study. And I said, that's true. That's why it's even more of a science, because we're dealing with something incredibly complicated. And that is why we have to be more rigorous and more careful, than someone studying electrons and protons.
Thanks, Simone. That's such a great answer, because my students do cover this question: is sociology a science? I'm gonna cut and crop that bit you just said for the argument for, because I think you've put that so neatly and so well explained. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Shall we talk about, I wanted to talk about your book, Everyday Violence. Could you tell us a little bit more about what it's about, how it got started, any details?
Yeah, I love talking about it because it's, a culmination of my 10 years in grad school. And it has really evolved out of my frustration that there wasn't a lot of academic literature on the phenomenon of catcalling or public harassment. And there was some activist work at the time, I think in 2011 when I got started, and I was putting together a syllabus from scratch for an Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies course, and I thought it was important to talk about the public sphere because there is, information out there on the workplace and maybe your family and your household or maybe an educational context, but not a lot on the public sphere. And I was part of a very vibrant urban environment in New York City. And having grown up there, though I'm not from the United States, I've been here since I was 11. And so having grown up in Brooklyn, I've experienced quite a bit of harassment. And so felt that my students were experiencing it as well, being 17, 18, 19 by and large. And they wanted to discuss it. So it sort of just was like a gap that I saw. And then I was like wondering which particular, I'm a very methodical kind of sort of person and sociologist. I was wondering if there are, theories that I can rely on or methodologies. And I didn't find too many in my classes on qualitative research or ethnography, let's say, like that there were like feminist methodologies. And so I kind of, I had to go outside of sociology in order to learn more, which again shows that we're interdisciplinary as well. And so I got a whole certificate in women's and gender studies, relying on like an interdisciplinary team of scholars at the Graduate Center. And I got a concentration completed in LGBTQ studies. And what that did is provide me the tools necessary to combine some of the theories coming out of women's studies with ideas coming out of sociology. So, I say that theories are only as useful as they are productive at properly describing something. And so, for example, I liked the work of Erving Goffman.
Yes.
And his work on presentation of self, because that certainly takes place for each of us, when we leave the house. And the way we interact with others communicates something about our position in society. And he had this concept called civil inattention. And I was just instantly fascinated by it because he said, here's how the city works. There are all of these strangers walking by one another, and they practice civil inattention where they're like, aware of one another, but they're civil about it, and they don't really pay too much attention to each other, and everything kind of flows. And my experience of harassment and that of my students contradicted that quite clearly, because women and folks perceived as women in the public sphere and others are not afforded that kind of civil inattention that Goffman was writing about. And he also talked about catcalling in his work in the 60s, and then combining that with the framework of intersectionality and with work around queer theory and work on queer theory of color. And I started exploring queer geographies and trans studies, and all of that together actually helped me expand my project from here's a phenomenon of catcalling in New York City, to sort of ask the bigger question. And I credit Dr. Vilna Bashi-Treitler for this, because she forced me to think bigger. And she said, okay, well, sure, gender and sexuality take place in public and they are shaped by these interactions, but what is your bigger question? And it was so frustrating because I was like, well, I thought that was the question, or I thought I had it all figured out. And she just kept asking me and saying, what is the bigger question that would connect your work to other people's work and make them want to read, your work. And so ultimately, after she forced me to do this, it grew to this new theorizing, rethinking violence to incorporate everyday violence, and then rethinking how we study violence to include daily interactions that accumulate over the life course. And so I constructed this model of everyday violence in the book, which was my dissertation initially, that has specific components that are actually kind of interchangeable. So, it's there, you have initiators of violence and recipients. And obviously, part of what I learned right away wasn't that it's just men doing this to women. It's generally men doing it to people of all genders, but there are also times when it's not just men harassing others. It's women and it's people in the LGBTQ community and whatever. So it couldn't just be about gender, and it couldn't just be about sexuality. And so then the model grew to incorporate not only that race, class, and space feature into this process, but then we have to think about levels of analysis, which include things like, neighborhoods and community and, laws and policies, let's say. Actually, it sort of the model can be applied to other phenomena, and you can insert other factors that you want to study. So I first hung out with catcallers, did a mini ethnography in Washington Square Park, and asked them to show me how they do it, and and why they do what they do, and how they make meaning of what people think about what they do. And that was fascinating, and I got tired of that pretty quickly, let me tell you. Yeah. So then I interviewed people impacted by the practice. So then throughout this process, I also honed in on what's important to me to illuminate as a researcher. And so it's I was developing, I was maturing, I was figuring it out. And so I decided that it matters more to me to study people who are impacted by an inequality rather than how the oppressor makes sense of what they do, which I still think is fascinating to do. Like, I think people who study white people and whiteness and white supremacy are doing the Lord's work. I just couldn't do it, at this point. And so I had a much larger sample of the people impacted by catcalling and LGBTQ directed harassment. And I conducted, 3-hour-long oral histories with each of them. It was pretty extensive. And so then I just kind of had to sit with the data and figure out, what the structure of the dissertation is, and then how to turn it into a book. And there are different ways to do so. And I chose to write it like a book from the beginning. And what that means is that my literature review and methods section were incorporated into my introduction. And then I had a couple of, topical chapters and a conclusion. And I informed my chair of this, and he sort of, knew that I don't follow the rules and that, I'm going to do what I want anyway. And he allowed me to write in a certain voice that's unique to me. And ultimately, that was the best way to go about it, because I didn't have to do too much to shift it into a book, my everyday violence book. I simply made it shorter. I took out some quotes. I reworked, it even more for accessibility. I had my students read over every chapter, and my friends who are not academics, in order for them to give me feedback about what's confusing. I think it's really important as a public sociologist to communicate your results very clearly, so that everyone can understand them. And I say public sociologist because not everybody is. Many people choose instead to go the route of, publishing articles that are behind paywalls that are not really accessible to everyone. But even the one article I published was open access, and so I was lucky enough to do that. And so as soon as I graduated, I sent my book proposal. Well, I actually sent my book proposal a year before, but everyone wanted me to graduate first. That's how editors tend to be. And so as soon as I graduated, I sent them the chapters, and it was pretty seamless from that point on to publication, because Rutgers University Press was the one I chose, and they are excellent at what they do.
Wow, 10 years, you said. That's something. Wow, that's impressive. I'm kind of itching to find out about interviewing the catcallers, but for sensitivity, I think we should look at the impact first. So what were kind of the common impacts that a lot of the recipients of catcalling, what were they saying? How did it make them feel? And I know obviously you looked at women and LGBTQ people, but maybe we could sort of take a general look. What sort of the general impacts you were finding?
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising findings that was also difficult to do during interviews is to realize that a lot of people come into their gender and their sexuality in a violent way, even before they hit the public sphere. So I would ask my participants, when was the first time in your life that you understood something about your gender and sexuality? And unfortunately, they would come back with things like, when I was 2, I was touched down there. When I was 4, I was harassed this way by my uncle. When I was 5, I was raped, and it was just so commonplace. And so that by the time they entered the public sphere, kind of going to school or whatever, it was just like the notion that these experiences once again reminded them of the moments that they faced. And I don't think people make this connection that it is triggering to people to experience yet another instance of not having agency or consent or control in a situation. And so things like catcalling and public harassment bring up memories. They bring up muscle memory and emotional memory, and so a person can respond to it in a way that a catcaller doesn't understand, because it's bringing them back to that moment. And so it started to be more about the connections to harassment experienced at home, at school, and at work, because we as people go through different spheres during our day. And so it was just sort of like, instead of just saying, here's what happens in the public sphere, I started to say, here's what happens in the public sphere and how it speaks back to what happened to these people in this and this and this context, and how it connects to like when they then go to work and are sexually harassed there, or come back and experience domestic violence or homophobic parents or whatever. So I think it also showed just the continuum of violence in a person's life. And that speaks to those criticisms of like, a catcall isn't a violence. No one punched you in the face. And not that we actually take that seriously anywhere, but it is a different kind of impact. And I started to talk about accumulation and that notion that came out of, studies of racism called weathering, when the body literally experiences erosion as a result of consistent racism. It's like a public health issue. And so I kind of applied that to my work. Obviously, I also had a significant number of people of color in my project, as that was important to me. And so for people of color, or for people who are multiply marginalized, there were all sorts of other impacts, because catcallers would use a racialized sexist catcall or some other one that's like transphobic or homophobic. So the impacts are cumulative, they're negative, they trigger people, and they are significant. I think it actually shapes how people move, how people choose where to live, how people keep time during the day, how they self-objectify and police, how they develop in terms of gender and sexuality or racial identity, or even their religious pathways. Like the article that I published first prior to the book was about the way Black people who were raised Christian and who are LGBTQ make sense of their like fragmented sense of self or community or belonging, because the LGBTQ community is so whitewashed, and they experience racism in that sense, and then their racial community is often homophobic, and they experience abandonment in that sense. And then to try to figure out their religious journey is like yet another layer, and it's actually connected to the spaces they occupy in the public sphere. So it was a truly intersectional piece of work, of scholarship, that makes connections between what people think are disconnected processes. But I think, to speak back to my earlier point about complexity, a sociologist's job, not that I see a lot of us do this well, but is to really make connections that speak back to how we're all pretty complex human beings.
What was that phrase again, Simone? Erosion, something where it
weathering.
Yeah. That's really, really interesting, because I just wondered, is that why that ends up in kind of a casual acceptance or normalizing that this just happens because of that continual weathering?
No, weathering is specific to folks who are impacted. You mean I don't think anybody just ends up taking it, I think it's just so commonplace that in order to get from point A to point B, you're obviously not going to address every single instance of racism or harassment. It's not realistic. But I think what's interesting on the part of society at large and diminishing it is that when something is quite commonplace and very daily, it's actually really difficult to confront. Yes. And that's part of its violence. And the reason why we define violence as episodic or as rare or as, a school shooting or whatever is because it's easier for our brains to digest that these are specific points in time. And it's much harder to understand that a person just experiences sexism anywhere they go during a day because, well, it feels overwhelming and all-encompassing. So I think it's kind of ironic that something so encompassing gets dismissed so easily, precisely because we can't understand how to start to unpack it or confront it. And so ultimately it's like that with racism, homophobia. It's just sort of like the most complex problems are actually part of our everyday fabric.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
There was this project, I think it's no longer available online, but the website was catcalled. It was called that. And I interviewed its creator, and she asked her participants to do a diary over the course of 2 weeks of every single instance of harassment. And all these people were super into it at the beginning. And then even just after a few days, they had to pull out of the project because what they realized once they saw it on the page is how constant and incessant it is. And it was like really bad for their mental health. And they quit the project a week in. And so I think I also interviewed another participant who did so via a Twitter thread where they would indicate every instance and people would then talk about their instances. And it's just, I think when you are able to just take a look at it all, nobody wants to feel as if they're constantly victimized in a sense, right? So of course you're going to downplay it. My mother experienced harassment as well. And obviously when I asked her, and I write about this in the book, like when I was 12, why this is happening to me, she was like, she's a pretty gendered person and into these rigid ideas, but she was like, well, that's what men's eyes are for. And I was just really floored by that, because when I said, well, what are my eyes for, she really didn't have an answer. And I think that, I often rely on my mother's responses to kind of gauge where society is at, because she's a pretty normal person and she's not an academic, and she speaks her mind whether you like it or not. And, she really does have these ideas about men's like predisposition to like violence and whatever. And I don't think that's right. Obviously I'm a feminist, and contrary to popular belief, we don't actually think men are inherently anything. And therefore it's not a good excuse to simply say they do this because they're men. And now obviously I have my own children. I have some sons, their gender kind of shifts, but it's obviously that it's taught and also condoned.
Yeah, I don't think there can be any doubt about that. And also, just looking at the full title of the book, was the harassment experienced by women and LGBTQ people different? Was it a different type of harassment?
Yes and no, because lots of people are LGBTQ women. So in that sense, I, as a person who's perceived as a woman, I'm an agender person, so I don't have a gender. But when I am interacted with by strangers, they assume I'm a woman. And so even in my example, there is a slight difference. So if I was a cisgender woman, I would experience this as just typical sexism. Being that I'm an agender person, I experience this as sexism, but also as an erasure of my identity. And being a lesbian person, and when I'm out with my wife and experiencing homophobia, homophobia and transphobia, they're more clearly about policing gender and sexual deviance. And things like catcalling are more clearly about sexism and heterosexism, where it's done in such a way as to say it's normal. It's a normal part of interaction between men and women, and that women enjoy it and men do it because they have to be aggressive and pursue their prey and whatever. So it feels as if the things that women experience, straight women, let's say, is more about reifying relations. And the things that LGBTQ people experience is more about silencing them and making sure they aren't a part of the public sphere.
And you started to touch on it then, but I suppose to truly understand what's going on here, you do have to look at it from the point of view of the catcaller themselves. That's really brave and interesting that you took that approach to go and ask them. So I've got to know what is behind this.
I wish I knew, because when I reflect on this now, I thought, God, you were so different and so brave. I think at that time, like I said, at the beginning of grad school, I never took a social course. I was a patient navigator for the American Cancer Society. I was a biologist. And so I just think I didn't understand a lot of my own positionality, and I didn't have a lot of the rage that I do now. And so I thought, I went to NYU. I get catcalled in Washington Square Park all the time. I'll just go over there and ask the people. And, it all felt very like easy to do in a sense. And it's weird now because they obviously harassed me quite a bit and also propositioned me and and it wasn't great at times. And now I'm just like, well, that was actually really unsafe, Simone. And I wouldn't, really recommend anyone do that without really thinking first about their safety or about their mental well-being. But I wanted to see, because I was influenced by Dorothy Smith's book, The Everyday World as Problematic. And that was a big influence on my needing to know how people engaged in something that takes place every day engage in it. And so I sort of relied on deception to some extent. And I would say, some people, because I would hang there, we would smoke a cigarette back and forth, we would shoot the shit, right? But I would say, and they would catcall as I was hanging out there. And I would say, hey, what you just did, some people think that's harassment. I said, I don't think so, but what do you think about that? And I would tell them, I'm doing a project for a grad school about it. And they would say, no, of course not. It's not harassment. And they would go into all of the typical excuses that men use to downplay their behavior. And I would say, well, how do you decide what to say? What about that girl over there? Or what about that woman over there? How do you make sense of it? And that's what gave me that rich data about how split-second decisions are made in everyday life. And that's how I learned that when a person is considered, when a target is considered, they think actually quite deeply, kind of, even though it's quick, about their perceived race, gender, sexuality, class position, age, stuff like that, because they would make these microscopic adjustments from one woman to the next based on what they thought was the entirety of her identity. So they say different things to someone they thought was a Latina woman, and then different things to someone they thought was a Black woman, but that she thought she was college educated and too good for them. And look at her going to her 9-to-5 job, you know, with her little dog. And there was a lot there that spoke to these men feeling powerless in society, right? And as it tends to happen, taking it out on folks maybe less or more powerful, depending on the interaction. So that's where the racial component came in, depending on the race of the initiator and the race of the recipient. And so that's why intersectionality was such an important framework to figure out, you know, how these things go together.
Yeah. And ultimately, I'm trying to work out, was it to get a reaction? Was it to try and get a smile, a laugh? Or was it to genuinely try and get a date out of the person? I mean, what's the aim behind it is what I'm trying to...
Well, up until my study, there was only one more academic study of actual catcallers done in 1984, the year I was born. And it was... done by a couple of sociologists, Bernard and Schaefer, I believe. And interestingly, the responses I got were the same. So not much has changed since I was born. And it was, you know, it was a couple of different things. Some of it was to kind of reinforce camaraderie between the men, especially if they're in a group doing this. So it's important to distinguish what takes place when a man is on his own or an initiator is on their own and when they're in a group, because by definition, that becomes about a different process. And so it's that it just depends. So some would say they're just having a laugh. Others would say that they would get dates and phone numbers and sex out of this. And like, I didn't believe them for
I'm not sure I believe that one.
And, you know, but I noted it down. And then I think what I learned from, you know, doing literature review around gender and sexuality and whatever, that a lot of these processes are there to reinforce gender norms and to make men feel better about themselves. And it's really not so much about the recipient at all. It's kind of unfortunate that like basically the women you catcall or the people you harass are interchangeable. They are completely irrelevant to what's taking place. It's not any specific person that matters. It's that this is part of how a lot of men get through their day. It's part of a lot of men's workplace behavior. So we need to also think about what kind of jobs are taking place in the public sphere. So, you know, it's men who hand out those tickets to see the Empire State Building. It's men who work the food carts and food services that way. It's not just construction workers, though they do it too, but it's actually, interestingly, part of the person's job throughout the day. And these jobs are also heavily male dominated. So it's kind of like affirming a boys only type of environment for construction workers, for people who do food trucks, you know, and people who are cab drivers, for example, and Uber drivers and stuff like that, right? So it was fascinating to see that these processes are done for each other. They're done to reaffirm one's masculinity, you know, and so other research has shown, international research, UK, Mexico, and the US, there was a study that showed that men who espouse very macho attitudes about gender and sexuality, you know, tend to engage in these practices more. And so I think that's, you know, that I wrote about how obviously masculinity is very fragile and it's under this constant perceived threat that like nobody, you know, actually inhabits. Like we're not a threat to one another in that sense, but that it has to be reaffirmed all the time by kind of discussing others, discussing women, discussing LGBTQ people, discussing fat people, disabled. Like it's just part of like this weird packaged deal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, the group behavior dynamic as well, actually. I can definitely see that. And, you know, there seems to be this thing amongst masculinity, you know, trying to outgross each other or, you know, who can tell the most offensive joke or who can make the worst sort of offensive comments. So, yeah, there's definitely that kind of one-upmanship within masculinity, without a doubt.
Well, it's incredibly homoerotic. Like sports culture is very similar. Fraternity culture is very similar. We have seen these things if we study these kinds of processes, that it's really about your boys, your squad, right? Thinking of you as this hot stuff, but you can't just make out with your best friend ultimately. So you're going to go talk about some woman's tits and ass and whatever. And it's just like, listen, if we just allowed men to have actual emotions, or to be the sexuality that they are, or to have three-dimensional lives and communication, we would solve a lot of this in an instant. Because particularly for men on the streets, being that they're often not white and not very rich, they kind of exercise their power where they can. And that's to be very clear, once again, I want to resist that myth that only men of color participate in this behavior. I just want to make sure and state that white men tend to do this in corporate spaces, in private spaces, in schools. They tend to work in buildings, and they then exercise their tremendous amount of power that way. They are the judges, the rapist apologists, they are Brock Turners, they are that kind of real threat. But it's easier to just kind of shit on men of color and say it's their behavior that's the problem, when you're refusing to see, what we're actually condoning on a systematic level.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you. So much to consider and think about there. Do you want to give a little bit more details if people want to read the book, where they can get hold of it?
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere now. I mean, you can pre-order it everywhere now, but Rutgers University Press, is definitely where, it's housed. But it's on bookshop.org. It was included in the 2021 Pride Month list of books to read. So I'm very thankful for their, putting my book on the list. I also wanted to just briefly speak about like what's in the book. I think that gets people really excited. So, the introduction, like I said, kind of details what I already spoke with you about, and sort of talks about the literature and the methods, and like what my call for participants said and how I went about this and whatever. And then the first chapter is on the initiators of everyday violence. And that's where I talk about like the race, class, and space of the initiators, and why they do what they do. And the second chapter is about the recipients and the impacts and strategies that exist. And then the third chapter is just on people who are, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, and so on. So just the sexual communities that are not typically treated well in the public sphere. And then the fourth chapter goes into transgender and non-binary people's experiences in the public sphere. And I think that's really important to disaggregate the LGBTQ acronym instead of treating it like one lump, one umbrella, whatever, right? So that's good. And then I start to do more structural work at the end of the book. And the sort of fifth chapter is on connecting the everyday process of catcalling to things like police brutality, and to gentrification, and to laws and policies, right? To like really embedded in, the world. And then the conclusion is about like, what should we do and what is being done and whatnot. So that's what the book covers. And it's going to be out September 17th this year. And a couple of people have used it in their classes, and it's been really well received by the students because, like I said, students have read it and given me feedback. And I think that's the best way, to do it.
More about yourself. You've got a website, and people can follow you on Twitter as well if they want to find out.
Oh, absolutely. So the website isn't always updated. My wife is so amazing and helps me with that. It's SimoneKolysh.com. And on Twitter, you can follow me at Simone Kolysh. I remain a lot less professional on Twitter of all places where I have the most followers because, I refuse to let academia censor me and my ideas and And I think it's just important for all students of sociology to not let the academic trajectory silence you, and to always remain very open to like how you can learn from not just other disciplines, but from art, from community, from activism, from like, grassroots activism, and to never close yourself off to even how you want to communicate something to others. And that's why, I always encourage my students to make like podcasts or collages or whatever. Like there's any number of ways to get information across. You just got to do it in a way that's compelling and simple to understand. And I also wanted to say that now that I'm done with this first year on the tenure track in a pandemic, I'm just finally coming out of this black hole to think about my next project. And so I wanted to just mention it briefly that this time I'm going to look at healthcare as a field, because that's how I began, right? My trajectory, wanting to become a doctor. And I'm going to take a look at transgender and non-binary people's reproductive journeys, whether they end in children, whether they end in, sterilization or hysterectomies or vasectomies or adoption instead. And it's really all about how queer and trans people and non-binary people make a legacy. And so I'm really excited, and I've been, and it's kind of like I'm always going to keep learning, but this project, I'm doing some things quite differently from this other project. I don't waste time. I've completed 36 interviews and can already see through it in a different episode for sure.
Well, that must be because you get up at 4:30 in the morning. That's how you get so much done.
Well, actually, I was just, like I told you, on the line with my boss at Race Reflections UK. And so I'm a consultant there. An associate disruptor, actually, is my title, which I love so much. And I was just talking to them about the first event I'm going to do for them, which is on Monday. And it's going to be on intersectionality and an exercise on applying intersectionality to your position in society and to understand how you relate to power and oppression. So that's an example of doing something outside of my job that is still very sociological and public sociology as well. And so I woke up to speak to her and to you. But it's really more that all of us are really struggling in a pandemic to sleep consistently. And I have OCD, so a lot of that anxiety and nervous energy needs to go somewhere. And unfortunately, a lot of academics are this way. It goes into trying to do a lot of work into overworking in order to distract your brain, from the uncertainty. And so, in a way, we connect with others during our interviews, but it's also quite overwhelming. And so I'm going to take a break in July and just kind of clear my head. And that's something I learned just recently to do, because academics can never stop working. And so I'm just going to take a break. And that's something I recommend graduate students do too, like enforce week-long breaks here and there for your head to clear. I also have 4 children, so please invite me for a podcast on how to balance church and children, because there's no good way to do it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure how much of a break with 4 children you really get, but do enjoy your well-earned break, Simone. And I do really, really appreciate you coming on, particularly at such an early hour in the morning.
I'd love to come back. Thanks so much. And thank you to your listeners. And please, send me a link so I can brag all about it.
Definitely. Thanks again, Simone.
All right. Bye. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye now.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com.